The festivity is abruptly cut short, and there's a near silence, a barely audible tremolo on D-flat from cello and bass. It's one of Beethoven's unerringly brilliant theatrical gestures in this work. And before we go into the fourth movement, which oddly is not the final movement of the symphony, I want to mention two things. First, Beethoven clearly treasured the tranquility and the solitude of the countryside, as we saw in the first two movements. Oddly enough, Beethoven had a certain contempt for the urban commoners that he was forced to deal with, burghers and other petty officials and merchants who often made his life difficult. But he certainly understood and caught the spirit of the Landleute, the simple country folk, as we've just heard. He clearly felt more at home with them. And second, even though Beethoven said that the first movement of the symphony was, quote, more an expression of feelings than painting, als Malerie, tone painting, not a literal representation of things in music, he obviously became more flexible as the work progressed, as the triple bird event in the second movement made clear. And the fourth movement, Storm, continues now in this very picturesque mode. As we've seen, composers loved imitating birds in their music, and they loved storms even more, I think. So Beethoven's fourth movement will now take its place as perhaps the gold standard in what was a long tradition of symphonic tempest in music. Here's a few notable examples. Of course, Vivaldi's Four Seasons from 1720 would have to include a storm, and his second concerto, Summer, does indeed. Storms became very popular in opera, in Rossini's William Tell overture, the opening scene of Verdi's Otello, or in the final act of his Rigoletto, where the ominous approach of the fateful storm is evoked by an offstage men's chorus that rises and falls, with little flickers of lightning and rumbling of thunder. And that was Rigoletto's poor daughter, Gilda, speaking of the night of horror. That great music written in 1851. And in orchestral program music, the bigger the forces, the more mammoth the sound and fury of the storm, even though the musical content often seemed in inverse proportion to the size and volume of the orchestra. That, the mammoth Alpine Symphony of Richard Strauss from 1915. There's Ferdi Groffet's 1931 Grand Canyon Suite, which, despite a terrific opening movement and some other clever things, it really seems to run out of ideas by the time the storm comes rumbling in. It's just my opinion. And in Hollywood itself, in 1939, the fine composer Herbert Stothart would use Robert Schumann's piano piece, The Merry Farmer, as the basis for cinema's most famous storm. Actually, it's a twister. There it is, with Auntie Em in her rocker and cows and chickens floating by as Dorothy and Toto are caught up in the cyclone. And who would have imagined, while The Wizard of Oz was finishing production in 1939 over at another fantasy factory, the Disney studios were at work planning an animated version of Beethoven's Pastoral Symphony for their great 1940 masterpiece, Fantasia. And how easy and natural it was for Disney's animators to depict Beethoven's detailed musical description of a country storm. But I digress. Back in Beethoven's day, there was in fact a German symphony written around 1784 when Beethoven was in his teens by the composer Justin Heinrich Knecht. his musical portrait of nature, subtitled A Pastoral Symphony, and it anticipates Beethoven in some pretty striking ways. It's also, believe it or not, in 5 movements with very descriptive titles to each. The brief second movement describes the darkening skies before the storm. Then the storm hits in the third movement. The fourth movement, also brief as the storm recedes. And the finale is, quote, a nature-transformed song of joy to the heavens movement. And movements 2 through 5 are also played without a pause between them. So Beethoven, it seems, had a pretty specific model on which to build his pastoral symphony, even though the earlier composer's concept is clearly influenced by Vivaldi's Four Seasons. And the music's idiom actually seems quite outdated for its year of composition, 1784. Again, the German composer was Justin Heinrich Knecht, that's K-N-E-C-H-T, his own pastoral symphony. Here's an example of his storm. Whatever its merits, it's a fascinating addition to our understanding of the era in which Beethoven lived and worked, and especially of the music that might have influenced him. So Beethoven's third movement scherzo, the merrymaking of the country folk, has been abruptly cut off, and we hear first the distant rumble of thunder in the cello and bass, and second, the patter of raindrops in the second violins, the wail of the wind in the first violins, moving to a diminished seventh chord, no surprise there, with scurrying eighth notes in the strings and sustained woodwinds. Moving to E flat minor. Then it all repeats, supercharged with tension, crescendoing and moving into F minor, and it's a big one. And when it hits, Beethoven adds 2 trombones to the orchestra, along with the first appearance of the trumpets and timpani. There were massive sustained chords in the winds and brass, which you heard, and dramatic descending arpeggio figures in the violins, which must qualify as the melody here. Big diminished seventh chord, and at the bottom of these columns of sound, the cello and bass are wildly rushing with this figure. The cello play groups of 5 notes, while an octave below, the basses play 4-note groups. Obviously, it's an orchestral effect. There's no way that this could be heard clearly. And the harmonic layout of the music, it's pretty basic, actually. You have F minor, our tonic key, E diminished seventh chord, A diminished seventh chord, moving to B flat minor, a lightning flash, then another lightning flash, arriving now in C major, which is the dominant key of F minor. And the raging storm in octaves by the full string section. And you see how effective those diminished seventh chords are in depicting the tempest. Then there's more shuddering strings. The violins and violas play tremolo like so. And the cello and bass continue to evoke the ominous rumble of thunder underneath. And you heard those multiple lightning strikes using this progression. F sharp diminished seventh, moving to B flat minor, and G7, and C minor, and C7, and moving to A major. Now there's an episode with the raindrop figuration in the first violins over a C-sharp diminished 7th chord. Then there's more tremors in the cello and bass, and this rhythmic figure in the woodwinds, and the raindrop 8th notes in the violins. And miles below, the cello and bass are rumbling. You heard sheets of rain there cascading in the violin arpeggios. And now a return of the big octave theme. 3 times, leading to a fabulous depiction through simple chromatic scales of gale force winds sweeping across the landscape. The high point of the drama. Plenty of diminished 7th harmonies and cascading tremolo violins again. All of this superbly structured, phrase by Beethoven. And as the storm dies away, we hear what I think is the single most stunning passage in the entire symphony. Beethoven's total mastery is so obvious here. The boom of thunder is gradually fading, just strings and timpani, that's all, on simple dominant and diminished 7th chords. And just the double bass is rumbling way below. And one last flicker of lightning, leading to the appearance of the sun, and a simple hymn in C major. And on this chord of the hymn, this is amazing. On that chord, the cello and basses, still with very fleeting 16th notes, far below the hymn voices, create one final non-rhythmic random rumbling of thunder moving out of the area, as they say, and giving way to the sunlight. I think it's the greatest moment in this work. And we move directly into the finale. And I know it's a very unfair comparison, and I have a great fondness for music of the early classical era that we've heard throughout this series. Thomas Arne and William Boyce and Gosse and Herschel and whatnot. But Justin Heinrich Knecht's Pastoral Nature Symphony makes clear just how towering is the creative power of Beethoven's music. It's likely that Beethoven patterned his Sixth Symphony's programmatic layout on Knecht's work, whose fourth movement title mentions, "The storm recedes little by little, the clouds dissipate." Here is that passage in Knecht's Symphony. And here again is Beethoven's storm receding into the distance, the appearance of the sun, and those astounding faint rumbles of thunder in the cello and bass, written only 20 years after Knecht's symphony. And with the frequency of storm music in the orchestral and operatic repertoire, Beethoven's accomplishment, with very limited forces but an overflow of genius, has never been equaled in its marriage of bold, visionary sound, its unerring dramatic instinct, with the sheer quality of the music itself. And the main motive of the finale that you heard is significant for a couple of reasons. It's a simple C major triad, just 3 notes, and it's written to imitate a rustic wind instrument, a shepherd's pipe or something hollowed out of a tree branch, an intentionally primitive sound, which is now taken up by a hunting horn in F major, with fifths in the violas and celli. Very magical writing. And this motif will signal every important structural junction in the finale. And as the finale begins, we realize that this pastoral symphony of Beethoven's consists of 5 and not 4 movements, as was the custom, and that the final 3 movements are linked together, as the program requires. Peasant party interrupted by the storm moves off, and now the shepherd's happiness and feelings of thanks, as Beethoven describes it. And even though we've seen that Beethoven did not invent this format where approaching storms are concerned, he certainly reinvented it in terms of its dramatic potential. Also important are the character and the rhythmic meter of this finale. There's no grand, triumphant fanfares here introducing the finale as in the Fifth Symphony, but a gentle pastoral, continuing the familiar Baroque tradition. Pastorals are graceful and harmonious in a lilting triple meter, often associated with the shepherds at Christmas, as in the Pastoral, or Pifa as it's called, from Handel's Messiah. Or here, music again by the English composer William Boyce, forced to take a back seat to the German Handel's wildly popular music in London. This is the second movement of Boyce's short overture symphony, number 4, a lovely and lively pastoral in all but name. And these examples give you an idea of the pastoral genre that preceded Beethoven. Here are 3 things now about the finale's architecture to listen for. First, the almost continual presence of that simple primal call. And it hovers over the music with that sense of joy that Beethoven spoke of. Second, just as in the second movement, there is an almost continuous flowing motion to this finale, beginning with a simple figure in the violins. And it evolves throughout, as is so typical of Beethoven. And third is the finale's unusual structure, its architecture, which consists of 5 major sections or panels, and all except the second one of them culminate in a grand climax, a broad, expansive passage with glorious, sustained harmonies in the winds and violins. Here is the first of these passages. You can almost imagine the Greek god of the sun, Apollo, riding through the blazing sky in his chariot. I don't think I'll go there now, not just yet. I assume that some of you know what I'm referring to. More about this at the end. So now we have these 5 major sections or panels upon which this finale is built. And as I said, all but the second contain that majestic music. So here's the basic plan. Sections 1, 2, and 3 almost function like a miniature sonata: exposition, development, and recapitulation. And the other 2 big sections, numbers 4 and 5, basically mirror one another, both of them containing that big, glorious climax that we've heard. So the first section begins with the shepherd triad motive, as we heard, which now becomes the main theme of the finale in the first violins in F major. And here's the subdominant chord. Yes, very important. Here it is again. And the theme now repeats in the second violins, as the first violins take up the pastoral filigree, leading to the first of those majestic passages. And we now hear a new vigorous theme with robust energy in its accompaniment. And as we move now into C major, the dominant key, where Beethoven, as he so often does, will take a piece of the theme. In this case, it's the end of this theme. This descending figure. Da, 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 da. And listen to how he uses it to extend this joyous music. And hear how it grew into a magnificent, full version of the simple shepherd motive. There's the subdominant chord. And that's the first of the 5 panels of the finale. Again, it's like a mini exposition. It had 2 themes, then the big climactic passage settling into the dominant key of C major. We now move back into the tonic F major, and the second major section begins, which is essentially a repeat of section 1, but the filigree passage will now modulate into B flat major, so the subdominant key, where we encounter a brand new theme, a lovely, graceful tune, very bucolic in character, especially with this progression. we've moved into D flat major for a return of the main theme. Again, we're in the second section of the finale, which functions as something of a development section. Now we move into C major with the shepherd theme in the cello and bass. But over it, the flowing figuration now assumes a new motivic shape, like so, which will return at the very end of the symphony. But now it combines with a full statement of the main tune. Here is everything together. And you heard the vigorous motive suddenly relax, while the shepherd tune in the flute, and a transition now right into the third major section of the finale. So there's great symmetry here. The first and second sections both begin the same way, and both ended with a grand statement of this main shepherd tune. But the second section introduced that lovely new theme, which unfortunately will not appear again. And the third major section or panel, it's like a recapitulation of the first section, the same sequence of events, except that the main shepherd tune is now heard in a new florid version. It's like one of Beethoven's keyboard improvisations, where he would take a simple and then just spin out a new variation of. Also, everything in this third section now will stay in the tonic key of F major, as is standard in a sonata recap. But there's more to come. Another transition now based on and the fourth section is upon us. And it sounds like a perfectly natural continuation of what has gone before. And that's the subtle beauty of this finale's design. The 5 sections are all united by similar shape and material, but at the same time they are clearly delineated. So sections 4 and 5 practically mirror one another. 4 begins with an unadorned, straightforward statement of the shepherd theme by the cello and bassoons, which Beethoven then will extend harmonically like so, with a D7 chord to G minor, then C7 chord to F. And this harmonic progression really increases the momentum into the return of that grandiose, expansive passage. And another transition now based on the main theme. It's used in so many ways. It leads right to the 5th and final section of the finale. But there was something new in the grandiose Apollo passage, if you will, that we just heard. When it appeared in sections 1 and 3 with the radiant violins and woodwinds playing above it like so, the main theme was at the center of the orchestral texture. That was the form of the theme in the first section, and in the third section it was the florid variation. But now, as we near the end of the work, and this splendorous passage returns in the 4th and 5th panels, the main tune is not heard. Instead, underneath the shimmery texture, the cello and bass play a series of majestic rising triads. This wide span of slow-moving harmonies creates a majestic, almost solemn effect as we approach the ending. And now the fifth section. It mirrors exactly the sequence of number 4, except that the shepherd's tune, with which section 4 began, is now heard in its florid version. And this flowing motion now will continue through this section. The harmonies will proceed as before. And when we reach the final grand peroration again, with the rising cello and bass, Beethoven now extends it through a new progression of harmonies. And as this exalted music soars over us, there is no mistaking its spiritual quality. And the coda. The flowing motion has stopped, and now the strings, in simple chorale voicing, intone the shepherd's tune, transformed now into a gentle prayer of thanksgiving. And as it rises, there is that all-important subdominant chord, which has been so prominent in this symphony, especially here with its obvious spiritual association. The woodwind choir echoes the strings. Then there is a final expansive C-dominant passage, rising and falling in the cello and bass. Again, simple dominant and tonic harmonies. And you may recall that back in the second section, the vigorous passage work in the strings, this pattern, very vigorous. Well, in the symphony's final 5 measures, it returns. Now, a serene thread of sound that envelops the shepherd's call in the distant muted French horn. The eternal flow and life-giving force of nature. And at the end of his original sketch of this symphony, Beethoven wrote, Herr, wir danken dir. Lord, we thank thee. A word about the Disney issue, which accounts for the Apollo references that I made in the finale. As many of you know, the Disney studios included a very abridged version of this symphony, Beethoven's Sixth, as part of their adventurous 1940 feature Fantasia. And it's this sequence, the Beethoven, that continues to draw the most criticism from purists, as well as those who seem concerned about not agreeing with the purists. I think that the Disney artist's conception and rendering of this music is utterly enchanting and unerringly appropriate to the spirit of the music. When you consider that, first, Beethoven himself embraced using his music to illustrate things, brooks, specific birds, thunder, wind, and rain. And second, the fact that Disney's setting of the action in ancient Greece, with the countryside populated with mythological creatures, including the gods of Mount Olympus, who interact with the local shepherd lads and lasses, it's entirely consistent with the preoccupation of 18th century society with the legendary Arcadian phenomena, which was a natural outgrowth of the Enlightenment and the Romantic reaction against the Industrial Revolution. And Beethoven was part of all of this. And part of the charm and the childlike innocence of Disney's setting is the way in which his artists absolutely captured, they caught the music, the flow, the sweep, the intimacy, the details, and the overall ravishing beauty of this music in their vision. The family of flying Pegasus that circle and glide down onto the surface of the lake, the kitschiness of the 1940s centaurs and centaurettes in the deep blue glade at night, and the way that lovely sighing motive near the end of the second movement was captured. The rainbow after the storm with the Cupids and baby Pegasus sliding down it under the water, where we see the rainbow's base through the bubbles. Some of that clownish stuff, though, with Bacchus and his donkey in the scherzo is a bit much, doesn't really work that well. But then there's the gathering on the hilltop in the evening, Apollo in his blazing chariot, the setting sun, the shades of nightfall, the constellation of Diana, and the sliver of the moon that becomes her bow. To me, this is one of the truly great examples of the art of animation. No matter what you think of the conductor's way with this music, it was, after all, the legendary Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra, and he absolutely believed, he was passionately committed, that this experimental film was the way to introduce the public to classical music. And back in the summer of my 11th year, when I came across the 2 LP set of the Fantasia soundtrack in our home, I put it on out of curiosity, starting with the Bach Toccata and Fugue. It may have been 1940s sound quality, and it may have been a scratchy old LP, but it certainly worked for me. I'm Lawrence Rapchak, and thank you for listening.